Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. The establishment just said the quiet part out loud and kind of exposed they only care about democracy when it suits them. David Plouffe, who, for you political nerds know, was Obama's campaign manager in 2008, and other than Obama, was single-handedly the most important factor in getting him elected. Credit to Plouffe. Ran a great campaign, really knew what he was doing, saw kind of the political pulse of where things was going. He was on MSNBC and basically acknowledged that if not for, well, he didn't mention Obama, but if not for Klobuchar and Buttigieg dropping out of the race 2 days before Super Tuesday, or if the establishment had stepped in 2 days later, Bernie Sanders would have won the nomination and, according to the polls, data, common sense, would have beat Trump, probably by a larger margin than Biden did. Let's take a look at David Plouffe's admission.
Let's just remember, one of the reasons Trump won back in 16 is, Kasich stayed in, Cruz stayed in, Rubio stayed in. And so, listen, if Klobuchar and Buttigieg had waited 48 hours to drop out, Bernie Sanders would have been the nominee. So a lot of this, will come down to after Iowa, maybe after New Hampshire.
Right.
Does this go down to one Trump alternative? But if a bunch of these knuckleheads stay in and split up that vote, that's where his 40% looks more formidable.
Bernie Sanders would have been the nominee. Of course, what he's talking about is after Biden won in South Carolina, thanks to James Clyburn, the media, it was like a 48, 72-hour pep rally for Biden. Remember CNN, MSNBC airing the rally in Texas where Buttigieg had just dropped out. Klobuchar had just dropped out. Beto O'Rourke came out of retirement, and they all stood for Biden. And the establishment and all the cable news outlets, and then New York Times, Washington Post, were basically de facto super PACs airing this endlessly in a last-minute rally to try and consolidate the field and allow Biden to win on Super Tuesday. And it worked. It would not have worked if Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropped out, day before the primary on Super Tuesday, morning of. It had to happen right after South Carolina. And by reports, Obama was the one that picked up the phone, calling Klobuchar, calling Buttigieg, and doing some political horse trading. You scratch our backs, we'll make sure you're taken care of later. We've all seen how that has worked out with the expert wizard transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg. But they'll push for him to be president maybe in 2028. So if you want to drill down, I have some of the numbers here. It really is true that if they had not dropped out, Bernie Sanders would have become the Democratic nominee. I mean, just look at the numbers here. California, which Bernie obviously won and had the most delegates on Super Tuesday. Well, because of early voting, Buttigieg had already gotten 6.2% of the vote. Klobuchar had already gotten 3.1% of the vote. If they're still in the race on Super Tuesday, on the day California votes, that would be far less delegates won by Biden, even though Bernie won California. If Buttigieg and Klobuchar had stayed in the race, Biden would have won significantly less of a percentage, but most importantly, delegates. And it ended up being a delegate game, obviously. Biden beat Bernie overall on Super Tuesday. Let's take a look by, almost 500 delegates. So in California in particular, Bernie's victory would have been more impactful in terms of the delegates if Buttigieg and Klobuchar had stayed in. Then you look at Texas. Biden only won by 4.5 percentage points. Buttigieg and Klobuchar, due to early voting, their amount was larger than Biden's victory margin. Now, would Biden have narrowly still won Texas? Perhaps, but by the delegates, he would not have won that many more delegates than Bernie. And again, the narrative is much different if Biden wins Texas by 1%. That, honestly, the narrative might be that's a huge victory for Bernie Sanders coming anywhere near in a place like Texas. Then you look at Massachusetts, which I would say Elizabeth Warren screwed Bernie there and many other places by not dropping out, but I digress. Biden won by about 7 percentage points. Well, Buttigieg 2.7, Klobuchar 1.2. And again, this is all early voting. So you have to expect if they were in the race, their numbers would have been higher, particularly Buttigieg, who obviously did well in New Hampshire, which is right next to Massachusetts. So their numbers would have been higher and would have pulled away from Biden's margin. So it honestly could have been Bernie winning in Massachusetts if Buttigieg and Klobuchar was still in the race. Then we look at Minnesota. Honestly, this could have been instrumental if Klobuchar in particular, because according to all the polls, she was going to win Minnesota, the state she represents, obviously, in the Senate. So if she would have won Minnesota, I mean, look at these polls. In the week before the primary in Minnesota, you have Klobuchar at 29, Biden at 8. Klobuchar 27, Biden at 9. Bernie 23, Bernie 21. Klobuchar stays in Minnesota. Biden might have not even reached the threshold to get any delegates in Minnesota. One more for you. Maine, not a huge amount of delegates. We're talking 24 delegates, but Biden only won by 1 percentage point. Buttigieg, 2. Klobuchar, 1. That's the difference. Bernie wins Maine. But in terms of not just the narrative, in terms of the delegates, if they would have stayed in the races, you have a much, much, much less significant victory for Biden on Super Tuesday in delegates. And then you obviously had some big states coming up, including Ohio, Florida, Arizona, et cetera, et cetera. COVID was in play. Obviously, Biden and the establishment was saying, yeah, go out, vote. CDC says it's fine, even though the CDC did not say it was fine. This was at the beginning of COVID when, over 3,000 people were dying a day, probably more than that. And the data was understated. So I'm not bringing this up, to piss anybody off. I'm not bringing this up to stand for Bernie, who I'm not so thrilled with now. We'll get to that in a minute. I'm bringing this up because at the end of the day, I think so many people have focused on Dem enter versus Dem exit. And I say, do whatever you want. If you want to exclusively focus on building a third party, have at it. If you are not of that view and still think here or there, if strategically it makes sense, trying to push somebody like Bernie in the Democratic Party or somebody else, say a Marianne Williamson and an RFK through the Democratic Party, have at it. It's not my role to tell you who to vote for. I personally think it's a good thing that Cornel West is running for the Green Party nomination, not in the Democratic Party, which I just interviewed him. So that's up. But if you look at it, it wasn't so much that Bernie lost because he ran in the Democratic Party versus third party. Well, clearly they rigged it against him, but also Bernie made several mistakes that left himself vulnerable to that. So it was also about the candidate making mistakes. In my opinion, a lot of people might not like this. As much as those polls that I just showed you, as much as a key factor was Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropping out, as I just showed you, if they stayed in, Biden gets less delegates in the main state, California, that had the most delegates. Biden might not even gotten any delegates in Minnesota if Klobuchar stayed in. Biden would have got less delegates in some of the other states he won, and Bernie would have won several of the other states, not to mention more delegates. But Elizabeth Warren was also one of the most instrumental reasons Bernie got his clock clean on Super Tuesday, because her margin in a lot of those states, including Minnesota, including Massachusetts, her home state, Colorado, Washington State, particularly early voting numbers, but on the day numbers as well, her margin was equally, if not more important than Buttigieg and Klobuchar in siphoning votes away from Bernie. If Elizabeth Warren would have dropped out after New Hampshire, she had already gotten her clock clean in Iowa. She had been embarrassed in New Hampshire, right next to her home state in Massachusetts. I believe she came in third or fourth in New Hampshire. If she would have dropped out then, Bernie's victory is even larger in Nevada. Biden would have still cleaned everybody's clock in South Carolina, but on the margins, some of Warren's vote might have went to Bernie. But more importantly, Bernie would have won significantly more states because Elizabeth Warren's margin on Super Tuesday in several of these states was the determining factor in Biden's victory. And Bernie would have gotten a lot more of those delegates, because if you look at Warren voters, a lot of their second choice was either Bernie or Buttigieg. Also, I think this was a mistake by Bernie. A lot of people who can't stand Elizabeth Warren, including myself, might disagree, but politics is politics, and sometimes you got to hold your nose to win. If Bernie would have made the call after New Hampshire, to Warren, bite your tongue. I apologize for all the snake emojis, which she was so ruffled about. I want you to be my vice president. Drop out now and endorse me. Can you imagine what that would have done if Elizabeth Warren drops out of New Hampshire, of the primary, and endorses Bernie Sanders right after New Hampshire? Forget for a second whether you can't stand Elizabeth Warren or not. Put that aside. Elizabeth Warren drops out, goes and campaigns with Bernie Sanders, aggressively tells her supporters, support Bernie Sanders, actually finally speaks out against Biden, particularly on the bankruptcy bill and all the corporate selling out Biden did as a senator from Delaware and as vice president, and strongly pulls some of her support to Bernie. He has a larger margin in Nevada, which Bernie cleaned everybody's clock in Nevada, but there's a difference between a 20 to 25% victory and a 30 to 40% victory. Then Biden still wins South Carolina, but Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropping out does not have the same impact, because you already have one of the main candidates who is doing better than Buttigieg and Klobuchar on Bernie's side, campaigning with Bernie, pulling her support to Bernie. Frankly, Buttigieg and Klobuchar might have not even dropped out if Warren had already dropped out and endorsed Bernie, because the writing would have been on the wall even more, because a lot of Warren support would have been going to Bernie. And polls for Super Tuesday states would have been showing Bernie doing even stronger with Warren dropping out and 100% supporting him. That is how politics works. Now, would I have wanted Elizabeth Warren to be Bernie Sanders' vice president? No, I don't think she's a progressive. I think she's a politically flexible individual. I think when she got into the Senate, she might have been more authentically progressive, but then got, this Clintonite brainwashing in her that, I'll have more impact if I'm at the table. And to be at the table, I need to sell out. And to be at the table, I need to water down my Medicare for All proposal. And to be at the table, I need to be fiercely against super PACs until I'm not, and have a super PAC in the last minute that gave me $14 million. So, bottom line, Obama's campaign manager, who I think is a neoliberal hack, David Plouffe, he's saying what the data shows: if Buttigieg and Klobuchar don't drop out of the race, thank you to Obama, Bernie is the nominee. Bernie then would beat Trump. I don't buy this. Oh, they go after him and, unleash all the recordings from him in the 80s, praising the Soviet Union. The writing was on the wall. Trump lost primarily. There's a lot of reasons, but primarily because of his horrible handling of COVID. I think you would have had Bernie as the nominee, a record number of young people out, probably more young voters than you've had in decades. I still think Bernie would have gotten that increased turnout in Georgia and other places among Black voters who wanted Trump out. So this makes a big difference in terms of not only, again, it's not just Dem enter versus Dem exit. It's what does the candidate do? Does the candidate make the right strategic decisions at the right time? Obama and the Democratic establishment did make the right strategic decisions at the right time in clearing the field so that it could just be Biden versus Bernie. And then, of course, the media, which I think the New York Times reported, Biden got nearly $100 million in free commercial airtime in those last 3 days between his victory in South Carolina and Super Tuesday. So that matters. That's how Biden, who didn't even campaign in places like Massachusetts, Minnesota, wins those states. And we'd be having a much different discussion on the left right now. This is not to push you back into the Democratic Party. Again, vote however you want. But at the end of the day, if Bernie made that decision to push Warren to drop out, do whatever you got to do. Apologize for snake emojis, even though it's not your fault. Apologize for your supporters, even though I think that was all overblown and nonsense, and Bernie supporters were not harassing Warren supporters, and get her to sign on the bottom line and come out campaigning for you. Go on 60 Minutes after you win in Nevada, but don't take the bait and, give a history lesson on Fidel Castro in Cuba, which the entire point of Anderson Cooper asking you about that, Bernie, was to have a 3-4 day distraction. Bernie's a communist. The answer is, Anderson, I'm not running for president of Cuba. I'm running for president of America. And I think a lot of 60 Minutes viewers, he wouldn't say this, but the dominant 60 Minute viewer is older, and they were typically not the Bernie type voter. I think the majority of 60 Minutes viewers have been fed a lot of manipulated narratives about me and a lot of lies. So I'm here to correct the record. Here's what I'm going to do for seniors. Here's what I'm going to do for their grandchildren. Boom. Pivot away from Cuba. And by the way, I know that Bernie's campaign and his top staffers were melting down when he took the bait on Cuba and had told him, they're going to ask you about Castro. Don't take the bait. Of course, Bernie took the bait. So you could agree with this, you could disagree with this, but the point of this is not only to look back, it's to look forward. At the end of the day, progressives, whether you're in the Democratic Party or running as third party, you have to be strategic. You have to not just be making decisions based on pleasing the base, pleasing the YouTube viewer, being pure. You have to make decisions based on math, based on winning, based on, yes, peeling off some of the normie Dem voters to your side, which you're going to need if you're going to win in a Democratic primary or be competitive and even get over a 5% threshold as a third party candidate. You're going to have to, in addition to catering to some of those voters, you're going to have to bring out some traditionally non-voters. So at the end of the day, Obama's campaign manager said the quiet part out loud, which kind of shows you, do they really care so much about democracy? Because if you cared about democracy, you would let it play out with the candidates that were already there, Klobuchar, Buttigieg. And if Bernie's the guy based on the field, you support him, because the number one thing, if you really care about democracy, would have been defeating Trump. They did not care about democracy. They cared about stopping a progressive who might have dared to tax wealthy people, might have dared to take some executive actions to take power away from big pharma and private health insurance, would have dared to close some loopholes against hedge funders. That was more important than democracy.